Next stop everywhere.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Next Stop Everywhere, the Doctor Who podcast. I'm Charles Skaggs. Very excited to talk today because I'm here for episode 130 to talk The Edge of Destruction with not Jesse Jackson, not Karen Lindsay, who are off lost in time and space. I'm here to talk with Fred Firestine, everyone's favorite commenter on the Next Stop Everywhere page and also on Twitter. And all-around cool guy from the Psych Rewind podcast. So, hi, Fred. How are you?
Hello, Charles.
Welcome
Thanks
to the
for
show.
having me. Yeah, It's great to be able to fill in, while Jesse's off in time and space, and Karen also.
Yes.
And
thank you so much for doing that, by the way. We really appreciate the help.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've been into Doctor Who for a while, and I've never actually been on a Doctor Who podcast, so this is great.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, and obviously we've never talked. So after probably, years of talking to each other on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot, I get to see you in person, and this is great. So I'm all excited by this. So, like I said, we're going to talk about The Edge of Destruction, which is a classic William Hartnell episode, the third Doctor Who story, after, of course, An Unearthly Child and the Daleks.
You may remember the Daleks.
Yes, yeah, it's kind of an important one, that episode, the Daleks. Well, this was kind of just a little two-parter. To give a little background real quick. Well, actually, I'll table that for the moment because I want to talk about Fred first. Fred, I gather you're a Doctor Who fan because you were the kind enough to recommend this episode to talk about. So, if you would, how about you kind of give everyone just a quick kind of general overview of your Doctor Who background, because I'd like to know how you're approaching other Doctor Who episodes and this one, and any other Doctor Who information you'd like to pass along. Would definitely appreciate it.
Okay, well, as with many things in my life, this kind of gets a little bit of life history. So I was born in Canada, and in the late 70s, my family moved south of the border, as I like to call it, to the United States. My dad is from the Philadelphia area, so that's where we moved to. And as a result, it coincided with the airing of Tom Baker episodes on the PBS station in Philadelphia, which I believe is WHYY.
Right.
And so I spent Saturday afternoons watching Doctor Who. Not sure if it's what they call omnibus format or if they had breaks, in between the episodes, but that was my start. The companions of that era is like Leela and Sarah Jane Smith.
Right.
So that was kind of my beginning, and then after those years, I went off to college, and things got busy, and there was no internet really to keep up with Doctor Who, so I kind of lost track. In 2005, when New Who came out, I was not, a Doctor Who, newbie, but it kind of reawakened my interest in all things Doctor Who. So I watched the new series, found, old episodes of the classic series wherever I could, but I had kind of completely missed anything that came before or after Tom Baker. I may have seen a few Peter Davison episodes previously, but that was about it.
So no Colin Baker, no Sylvester McCoy.
Yeah, nothing. So really, I've spent the time since 2005 kind of reacquainting myself with Classic Who, as with the rest of us. I've been watching, New Who kind of develop. So that's my background. And over the past few years, I've never been a big attendee of conventions or anything like that, but I've had the opportunity to attend a few conventions right here on Long Island because one of the early Doctor Who podcasters, a man by the name of Ken Deep, who did the Podshock podcast, has organized conventions here close to home. And he actually also hosts a monthly viewing of a classic Doctor Who story. So that's been fun to get to interact with fans in that way.
I follow Ken on Twitter and Facebook, and he seems like a really neat guy, and I'd really love to go to one of his conventions someday because I think.
Yeah, well, you're welcome anytime.
Oh, I'd love to. I'd love to meet him.
It's not super convenient to get here, and people kind of think like if they're coming from New York City that it's in the woods somewhere, but that's just because of where the convention's located.
Well, I'd be coming from Columbus, Ohio area, so.
Ken's a great guy. So that's kind of my recent involvement with the Doctor Who fandom. And just randomly, I've picked up a few books, and I've got some artwork on my walls. I've got a spinning the spinning TARDIS mural on one wall, and I've got a Doctor Who themed billboard that I made for myself. And a couple books that I've picked up is one called Who Graphica, and it's an infographic guide to space and time. It's called. And I just happened to hear about it on a podcast, but it's interesting in the fact that it's not strictly a Doctor Who history. It gathers a lot of Doctor Who data into infographics.
Yes.
So if you like that kind of visual presentation and like making correlations of things that have happened on the show, it shows one graphic, for example, is all the episodes that certain villains have appeared in on kind of like a time, not really a timeline, but like a grouped, like if the Daleks were in whatever 100 episodes, you'd see 100 little dots kind of thing. So it really gives you a good visual representation of how many times certain villains have appeared, for example.
So one you definitely recommend for Doctor Who stats junkies then?
Yes. So it's called Who Graphica. And then another one, which is a little more common, I picked up, I was shocked to find this at Costco, is the DK Doctor Who, the complete visual collection. So that focuses, if you look at the artwork, on the new era, but it goes all the way back into the classic era, covering villains and characters, and just like one page per topic, kind of like you would see in all the kids' DK books, if anyone who has kids who's had those science, type books.
Now, they do some really nice kind of encyclopedias and whatnot for various TV shows and comics and whatnot. I have a couple of their DC and Marvel Comics ones.
Oh, I've seen those, yeah.
Yeah, and they're great. The problem is, of course, you buy these books and then like a couple of years later it needs updating.
Oh, sure, of course. It's not like a Wikipedia or something,
Exactly. So they're great books though. They're great to look at and flip through, and especially if you like reference material. For whatever reason, if you like.
But for something like this, I console myself with the fact that Classic Who is done. So anything that's in here about Classic Who is not going to change.
Well, that's true. That's a good point. That's very good argument.
Yeah.
It's kind of Classic Who is now a fixed point in time, to use a reference from the show.
That's right.
All right. So
nobody go back and change it.
Exactly. Well, time can't be rewritten. Amy Pond says so. So today we're going to talk about The Edge of Destruction, which is a William Hartnell episode. And I kind of feel like we should be talking a Tom Baker episode because, hey, today's Tom Baker's 85th birthday.
It is.
Happy birthday, Doctor.
I don't want to feel like I'm stuck in a Tom Baker rut.
Right.
So, that's why I kind of got out of my comfort zone, like I said. But yes, happy birthday to my doctor.
Yes. And Tom Baker was obviously as I've talked about here on the podcast before, Tom Baker was my doctor, the first doctor I experienced, although I caught the tail end of his, run with The Keeper of Traken and Logopolis. So essentially Peter Davison became my doctor, but Tom Baker was the first doctor I was introduced to. Mm-hmm. And that first regeneration definitely overwhelmed me. And I posted something on our Next Stop Everywhere page about that, coincidentally, because apparently Fathom Events is releasing Logopolis into the big screen movie theaters here on March, I believe it's March 13th, 10th or 13th, somewhere in there. I've got the specific date on our Facebook page if we want to check it out, and also the link. But I'm definitely going to that. I'm a huge fan of that episode, and it definitely shocked me to, like, okay, I just started getting into this guy, and then all of a sudden he dies and is replaced by a completely different actor.
Yep.
And
yeah, I may have actually been confused back then when I caught, like, and I've heard you talk about this too, right?
Yes.
Like I caught a different story and it was a different doctor and I was all thrown off.
Right. Yeah, it was definitely, it's obviously, as an American TV watcher, especially in the 80s when I started watching through PBS, this definitely threw me. It's obviously something that American shows don't exactly do, unless you count Bewitched, which they replaced Darren's, but that wasn't any kind of regeneration as far as we know. And
No, it was
or was
sort
it?
of unheralded.
Exactly. So maybe Darren's a Time Lord. Who knows? But here so let's get into The Edge of Destruction, and this was a very interesting two-parter. Like I said, it was Doctor Who's third ever story. It's written by David Whittaker, who wrote a number of important episodes back in the day during the first, second, and third Doctor runs. He wrote the Rescue. He wrote the Crusade. He wrote Patrick Troughton's first story, The Power of the Daleks. Wrote the follow-up, The Evil of the Daleks. Wrote The Enemy of the World. The Wheel in Space. That was the episode that introduced Zoe. And
Wow.
The John Pertwee story, The Ambassadors of Death, which is a personal favorite of mine from the Pertwee era. So pretty important writer, and this was obviously his first Doctor Who story. And also, the story was directed by Richard Martin for the first part, The Edge of Destruction, and then Frank Cox for the second part, The Brink of Disaster, which sounds a lot like just a euphemism for the Edge of Destruction, but hey, it's the same.
Well, it was
it's the
a
same
theme.
story, so you know.
Yeah, that was the sort of interesting part about Classic Who, is that it seemed like every single episode within a story had its own title, so
Right.
it could be a little confusing if you were talking about the episode title versus the story title.
Exactly, and sometimes they're not always when these classic episodes in the Hartnell and early Troughton eras are referred to. It's mostly because that it's the commonly accepted title that fandom, for whatever reason, decide we're going to latch onto this, and sometimes it's the first episode of the story becomes the overall title. Sometimes not.
Mm-hmm.
This case, it is, because obviously the first part is The Edge of Destruction. And give a little background on this one. When Doctor Who first was commissioned by the BBC, they only committed to the first 4 episodes that made up An Unearthly Child. And then all of a sudden, midway through the production of An Unearthly Child, they upped the production order to 13.
Right, so that's 13 25-minute episodes.
Exactly. So if you do the math here, An Unearthly Child, which was a 4-parter, then you had The Daleks, which was a 7-parter. Well, what's 13 minus 11? That's 2 episodes. So hey, they needed a 2-episode story. And with only just a little tiny budget, even tinier than usual for Doctor Who, especially Classic Who, they commissioned The Edge of Destruction to kind of fill out that initial 13-episode order.
Right, and renewal wasn't in the bag at that point, I don't think.
No, but until The Daleks, which was huge, and apparently got Doctor Who the rest of that first season. So, where we got to see other episodes like Marco Polo, The Keys of Marinus, and others. Essentially, this is just a lot of fans kind of take this for granted that they had like 7 stories or whatever, but no, they were only guaranteed at first 1, and then these other 2, and then it's only through cosmic fate that the Daleks captured everyone's imagination, and Doctor Who became a hit. So
Yes,
we should all be
love him or hate him. That was sort of the thing that got the ball rolling.
Exactly. So here we are, 55 years later, and doing a podcast about it. So go figure. All right.
Yeah, I was going to mention actually we're pretty close to 55 years exactly.
Well, actually, it was 55 years, November 23rd, 1963.
Right. Well, but it's 55 years to this episode.
Oh, I see what you're saying. 55
Yep.
years to the Edge of Destruction. Yes, you're absolutely right. We're very close. I think that the episode, did that air in February or March?
Yeah, it was February 8th and 15th.
Okay. So yeah, we are very close because today, I believe, what is today? The 20th of January. I had to check my phone because I wasn't sure. And let's get, Fred, did you have anything you want to talk about the background of the show before we get started into the heavy lifting of the topics?
Okay. Did you want to talk about the viewing of Classic Who or the episode itself?
Why don't you talk about, I know you made some rather detailed notes, so I don't want to waste those. So why don't you talk about, as a casual Who viewer, why don't you talk about that and what fans might be in for if they're not if they're more accustomed to the modern era and they haven't watched any Classic Who.
Right. Okay. So recently, maybe a few months ago now, I decided I was going to embark on what's really like a bucket list item of getting through all the Classic Who stories. And you get kind of like, it's kind of like reading the Bible in a year, if anyone's ever experienced that. Like you get through Genesis and Exodus, which is kind of like in a story format, and then you get into Leviticus, which really bogs you down in a lot of details. So similarly,
Yes.
Classic Who, you start out with sort of a light story, and then you get into some really strange stuff pretty fast. So these stories are told in 2 or more episodes, as we've talked about.
Right.
And early on, they vary from 22 to 45 minutes. Now, so you really should kind of pace yourself and respect the episode by episode format. The modern idea is to binge things. With Classic Who, that'll kill you because the pacing is very different. And
well, you just have to keep the time period in perspective.
Yes.
Because it's 1960s, 1970s, 1980s storytelling, and obviously it's not as fast-paced, quick cuts, and it's a much more leisurely viewing.
Yeah, you could see that if you look at like crime shows or dramas, anything, like Twin Peaks. Obviously, you know a lot about Twin Peaks, and that's a 1990s show, and the pacing for that seems like a snail's pace compared to what we see today.
Right. But most of that's though David Lynch. So if you're familiar with the David Lynch's style, it's a little extra slow for a reason.
So yeah, I mentioned briefly before about omnibus format. This is the Doctor Who version of binging, which if you watch this on like a public television station, they would kind of cram it all together. They would remove even the beginning and end credits for each episode and make it seem like a single unified story.
Right.
The problem is that if you're watching at this pace for 2.5 or 3 hours, you could really kind of snooze out. So that would be my first recommendation: is pace yourself, and you may actually enjoy it more if you watch it in small chunks.
Yeah, it does give you more of a break. I know that personally, me growing up, I watched that's how I was introduced, was the omnibus format, where or what I call essentially like the TV movie format, because you had maybe typically 4 episodes that were all stitched together. You didn't have, like you said, you didn't have the end credits for those first 3, and a lot of the there was a lot of abrupt editing because like they would have like initially in this individual episodes they would recap just maybe the last couple of moments of the previous episode to catch everybody up on the cliffhanger. So that was kind of like chopped there and kind of stitched together. And it depending on the episode, it made for some interesting viewing. I typically watched on like a Saturday afternoon.
Yes, right.
And where it aired on my local PBS station out of Cleveland, WVIZ. And so it was in the middle of the day, so I was more energetic. And of course, at the time, I'm 15, so I'm like I have all kinds of energy. But if you were older, or if it was on like say 11 o'clock at night, and God forbid it'd be interrupted with pledge breaks from the local PBS station, this could drag out a while. It could be like 2.5, 3 hours by the time, depending on how long the episode is or how long the story is.
Right. So I'm just saying, take advantage of a modern era and pace yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, BritBox is your friend. They have 90% of the available episodes. I made a note of things that are not on BritBox, so you can find those elsewhere if necessary.
Right.
So that's the first thing. The other thing is, remember, especially in some of these first Doctor stories, use your imagination, because they were definitely experimenting. You know, the 60s were a time where television was still relatively new, and there was a lot of experimentation going on in visual media. So you'll find episodes like in one, they get lost in a world that has kind of like no boundaries, and things pop up because they think of them. You know, it's kind of like they're visualizing their fears, you know, stuff like that. And yeah, it's going to look kind of cheesy, and it's a lot of people walking around in like stocking, you know, material. But if you kind of go with it and realize what they were trying to achieve at the time, then you can have a lot of fun with it.
Excellent. All right. Anything else before we get into our main topics?
Well, I would say the final thing about watching Classic Who is it will help you to understand the show's long history and to understand the references in New Who, so you can get excited when you see like your first Dalek or Cyberman episode or whatever it is.
Or like the Easter eggs when the modern era series references something from a past episode.
Sure.
Like the episode Twice Upon a Time, which referenced a lot from the 10th Planet, which was William Hartnell's first story. So.
Oh yeah, that was a big crossover, sure.
Exactly. So so it's all one show, you know, all the way from 1963 to now. And that's one of the cool things about Doctor Who is that, you know, those eras, the modern and the classic era, are connected, and that's why I love talking Classic Who, and I love talking episodes like The Edge of Destruction, and can't wait to talk about this one. So
all right,
so let's get doing. So obviously this stars William Hartnell as the first Doctor, Carole Ann Ford as Susan Foreman, the Doctor's granddaughter. William Russell as Ian Chesterton, or as the occasional reference from the first Doctor, Chesterfield.
Yeah. I forgot to mention Flubs.
Yes.
Because you'll see if you watch this episode and the other first Doctor episodes, he stutters and he'll misspeak things.
Yes.
And because it was too difficult to cut and restart, they just let it ride, baby. It was like classic theater.
Well, a lot of it was live recording, and they just went right along with it. Yeah. So.
Yes.
And then also Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright. So, all right. So first topic I want to talk about, as we discuss The Edge of Destruction, the first Doctor and Susan. And Fred, I want to get your thoughts on the first Doctor in this story. There's a lot with him. His distrust of Ian and Barbara comes out in this episode. There's a lot of paranoia coming from everyone in this episode. And Susan has a bit of an emotional breakdown in this story, multiple times actually, and especially with a pair of scissors. So I want to get your thoughts on the first Doctor and Susan and and what they experience in the story.
Yes. Well, in these early episodes, especially the relationship between the first Doctor and Susan is established as like, this is my granddaughter, and we really never get any additional explanation for the rest of the series about this.
Right.
But as you said, in this story, because of the mental distress that they're going through, which we don't really understand until the end, it becomes an us versus them situation where Susan never doubts in her grandfather at any point, but she feels like he's being threatened, and somehow it's Susan and Ian, it's Barbara and Ian's fault.
Right.
The scissors that you mentioned were controversial in that they violated standards and practices at the time.
Yeah, they got a note. They got a note from whatever children's watchdog division of the BBC about that.
Yep.
There's like, like, you guys shouldn't be doing this, but too late. It already happened, so they just didn't do it again.
But yeah, there was in this episode, because it was so internalized and scaled back, there was a lot of Susan walking around like a zombie.
Yeah, it was Susan. Susan's really interesting in this episode. Like I said, she has now normally in if you watch her, she's only in 10 stories, and then leaves in the Dalek invasion of Earth. But for most of the stories she's in, she is very emotional, especially compared to her grandfather. And she tends to overreact to a lot of things. She's screaming a lot, and maybe this is why Carole Ann Ford left the show, partly because of the frustration that Susan was essentially just this screaming teenager, and that she wasn't as initially pitched. Not just this, completely intelligent prodigy, and just turned out to be this normal overreacting kid. And here, and we get the impression that both the Doctor and Susan, along with Ian and Barbara, are being affected by the TARDIS, and that we find out later in the episode. So like they start off with amnesia. The Doctor ends up getting this gash on his head. Susan ends up recovering her senses enough to have this special healing bandage that she slaps on him. And basically it's got like little stripes on it. And apparently as the stripes fade, apparently that means that the healing is working.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Which is why, like, as the episode progresses, you see less and less stripes on the Doctor's bandage. And
this is like in early Who, we had these things that again kind of disappear as the series goes on. Initially, the TARDIS had this food replicator kind of thing, which is where in this episode they keep coming up with pouches of water.
Right. I find it interesting that all the water comes in pouches as opposed to just like a cup or a mug. Like a water dispenser, or like or like a water cooler or something.
Astronauts drink things out of pouches.
Yeah, exactly. But the fact that the interior of the TARDIS has gravity might lead you to think that, okay, hey, we don't need to put water in pouches for whatever. Maybe it's just me. But they get Susan tends to her injured grandfather. And then all of a sudden, Susan becomes convinced that there's this alien presence aboard the TARDIS. Now, as it happens, that doesn't turn out to be the case, unless, of course, you count the alien being the TARDIS. But what did you think initially of Susan kind of starting the ball rolling with the implication that they're being controlled by some alien force?
Right. Well, obviously, this was a story device where it's kind of like you imply that something is happening when there's really nothing there. I mean, it ends up being strictly paranoia.
Yeah.
But it was also kind of an interesting misdirect for at least some of the episode. Like, maybe it's an alien, or maybe the alien's inside of you.
Yeah.
So yeah, they kind of run with that for a while.
Yeah. This episode kind of reminds me of this Twilight episode, the monsters. I think I'm trying to remember the title. It's like the monsters or have arrived on Maple Street or something. But that was essentially where this neighborhood gets all paranoid with each other.
It was kind of like a Red Scare episode, if I
Exactly,
remember
and they're kind
correctly.
of like accusing each other of things, and it turns violent just as this paranoia builds and builds. And that's kind of what happens here, is that because this is essentially a bottle episode where we're inside the TARDIS. I mean, and this is probably the only story that takes place the entire length inside the TARDIS console
Well,
room.
or at the very least, like later on, there's a lot more going on in the TARDIS, right? Even
Right,
as you get into the, well, I don't know about Pertwee because the TARDIS was sort of closed for a while,
right,
but then as you get into like Tom Baker, they really amp up what the TARDIS can do, and by the time you get to the modern era, it's this boundless, possibilities. It's got a swimming pool, who
right,
knows what.
right. And just which was good because they kind of left things open ended so that the writers could take it in whatever direction they chose. Um, and here, obviously, with it just being the third story, they're still finding their feet. They're just still trying to kind of figure out the mythos.
Yes.
And here, with this episode being what it is, it's a great character episode, I think, because we kind of see. I mean, we had glimpses of little things like the Doctor's mistrust of Ian and Barbara and whatnot, but a lot of stuff gets said in this episode, especially in the second part, and the Doctor ends up getting confrontational, and he's ready to boot Ian and Barbara off the ship.
I'm going to
His
turn this
ship.
TARDIS around.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Like if you kids don't stop behaving, I'm going to turn this TARDIS around, and we're going to go home. But and Susan keeps pleading with him, no, grandfather, don't do that. I kind of like these Earth people, and the Doctor's just insistent and angry, and just really he's really upsetting, especially to Barbara. And so, what did you think of that sequence where the Doctor's ready to throw Ian and Barbara off the ship?
Yeah. Again, there was a lot of complaining in those first few stories that, hey, you told us we were just going to take a little trip, and now all of a sudden we can't get back home,
Right.
and you're telling me that you can't really control where you're going. And it wasn't to the modern era where the TARDIS takes us where we need to go. It's really like I push the buttons and hope for the best.
Right.
So this is why Barbara, in particular, is getting upset that she just wants to get home to 1960s England, and the Doctor can't seem to do it. And again, because of this mental distress, it kind of is all coming to a head.
Yeah, and as that's kind of been surmised as the decades have progressed, essentially that the Doctor at this point doesn't really know how to fly the TARDIS, because obviously we find out that he stole the TARDIS from Gallifrey and didn't bother reading the instruction manual, and just kind of wings it, and it's really the TARDIS that kind of does most of the flying, taking the Doctor and his companions where the TARDIS feels they need to go.
Yep.
And but here, the Doctor's essentially like he thinks he's controlling the ship. He thinks he's in charge, and that's not the case, as it turns out. So now, later in the episode, after we have, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the TARDIS. They eventually find out that there's the strange force is in fact this fault that's taking place in the TARDIS. And then after solving this problem with, getting down to the last few minutes, as it turns out, before the edge of destruction, and hence the title, that situation gets worked out, but there's still that kind of hurt feelings that Barbara's feeling, and kind of at Ian and Susan's urging, the Doctor finally goes to Barbara and tries to make amends. So what did you think about that scene where the Doctor kind of tries to, he admits that, it was Barbara figured out the problem, and kind of tries to smooth things over with her.
Yeah, this is a kind of an early example of the doctor giving, if not a half-hearted apology, then it's not necessarily a convincing apology.
Right.
Yeah,
I thought this was, and I think it's interesting because this is essentially like the first major warm-up of the Doctor that we see. That
yeah, it's true.
he's kind of smiling and being, especially to Barbara, he's being very polite and like, hey, he takes her, escorts her by the arm to the control room, and he's trying to be chivalrous and trying to make up things to her, and she eventually goes like, okay, all right, I'll go along with this, and relents. I just really like that
Hmm.
sequence in
Well,
this
by the
story.
end, by the time they get to the introduction of Marco Polo,
Right.
they're all kind of like happy and joking, and hey, let's go play on the
Yeah.
snow planet.
Right. Yeah. Susan goes outside and she's like throwing a snowball at Barbara and or whatever, and then they go outside and that kind of sets up the next story. So, and that was pretty good. Anything else about the first Doctor and Susan before we move on?
Nope. Like I said, I think what kind of defines their relationship in the beginning is, I want to go home.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, let's move on to our second topic, which naturally is Ian and Barbara. Um, as we kind of segue from that, from the first Doctor and Susan, Ian and Barbara, obviously, there are entry point characters. We're experiencing everything going on in this strange world of the Doctors and Susan's through their eyes, their point of view.
Yes.
And obviously, as you mentioned, they're kind of kept there against their will because the Doctor can't figure out how to get them home. And some of that frustration obviously comes through in this episode when things start getting paranoid and and tensions rise, and just whatever reason they're being affected by the
Well, I
TARDIS.
mean, if you think about where they've been to this point, in the
Right.
first story, you know, uh,
An unearthly child,
basically
yeah.
the first couple of stories, they basically get thrown into the line of fire. You know, it's not like a fun exploration of time and space.
Right. I mean, it's an adventure, and whether unfortunately, this adventure is also life imperiling, and it's not just hey, let's go here and let's enjoy this time zone, and nothing bad will happen. Bad things happen because hey, it's conflict, and conflict obviously makes a better story.
Hmm.
Um, and so Ian and Barbara, they're experiencing because of, and we don't know exactly how many. I mean, we know that the obviously the first two stories have happened. We don't know if there's been any other adventures off screen
Oh,
until this
that's
point.
true. Yes.
Until this point, so maybe some frustration settling in, especially on Ian and Barbara's part, where they're just like, "Can't you get us home already? You promised us to get us home." And then later, of course, when you got the Doctor threatening to throw him off the ship, they're like, "Hey, we may never get home. What are you doing? You promised us." And and again, that also creates this conflict that I think just drives this story a lot. Um, so we have Ian. Actually, I take that back. Um, Barbara, I want to talk about first because Barbara responds to the Doctor's accusations of sabotage. And this is where they have their kind of big fight. And Barbara really lays into the Doctor here. And I thought this was a really good scene where she's just like, look, Doctor, like Ian and we risked our lives to save you and Susan from the Daleks. And then, before that, Ian helped save your life in the Cave of Skulls. And if it wasn't for him, you'd be dead. And and she's just really pissed off at him. So what do you think? What do you think about Barbara in this at this moment?
Yeah, well, that's it. This is how she breaks through to the doctor, as we've seen, more recent companions do,
Right.
where he can't just sit in his ivory tower saying, "Well, I'm a Time Lord who's however old he was at this point,
Yeah.
and you people don't know what you're talking about."
Right.
So every once in a while he needs to have his flaws reflected at him a little bit.
Yeah. And Barbara really stands up to him, and I really like that because it kind of showed that hey, she's not a pushover, and she's not just some wallflower that's going to be overridden because the doctor gets what he wants all the time. She stands up to him. She calls him out when he's wrong, and and her tirade ends up getting interrupted though because all of a sudden she sees this cathedral clock that the doctor keeps in the console has melted strangely.
Oh yeah, that was kind of wild. See,
Yeah,
this is the kind of stuff
yeah.
that
This is where it gets a little surreal, kind of Salvador Dali-esque, where we have these melting clocks.
right, you see this in Classic Who, and maybe you could execute it better today, but that was really, you know,
Yeah,
outside of the box.
yeah. I'm sure for 1960s viewers, they were probably like, "Whoa, that's trippy."
Right,
And
and
that's
you saw stuff like this in the Twilight Zone and similar shows of that era.
right. It probably definitely blew their minds, I'm guessing. And and it's not just that clock. It's apparently all the timepieces, their watches and what have you. And Barbara obviously is a little freaked by this, and she rips off her watch. And this funny, it kind of makes me smile a little bit. She rips off her watch, throws it down the hall, and then takes off running away from it.
Have we mentioned that classic era female companions have a habit of screaming and running?
Yeah, unfortunately, that was the stereotype back then, and that's kind of, I would think, another something to kind of keep in mind when you're watching Classic Who is that obviously women were not as strong as they are today, depicted on television.
Right, but even when you get to the point of Joe Grant, who
Right,
kind of spans the second and third Doctor era,
right.
and I've seen, what's her name? I'm going to blank on her name because I'm trying to think of it on the spot. But I've seen her at several conventions
Katie
now.
Manning.
Yes, and she will talk about how it's a little bit dated now, but if you consider that she was an independent woman, she was a scientist, and she was kind of standing up for herself and doing all kinds of dangerous things. That was an example, to the young girls at the time.
And she, and then obviously, like with Joe Grant and especially Sarah Jane Smith, kind of calling the third Doctor out on his chauvinism a bit.
Yes.
So obviously, yeah, obviously the decades go on and attitudes change, and Doctor Who has changed accordingly, and continues to change really. So the Doctor ends up, after all this chaos and Barbara running off and whatnot, he comes in with this tray of drinks.
Oh
And
yeah.
his nightcap, and I'm putting this in quotes. So he's like, "Hey everybody, let's just kind of chill out and have a drink."
It was a step above a hot toddy.
Exactly. Like, yeah, we're just gonna have a nice, have a, bottle of Bosco or whatever, and take it easy. And everybody's got to go off, and they go retire for the evening. Barbara and Susan get into like nightgowns, and
Yeah, Ian spends the rest of this episode in a robe.
yeah, exactly. And he's barefoot. He's just walking around. He's probably just in his underwear with a bathrobe over him, which I thought was kind of hilarious. Very Arthur Dent, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just needed a towel, you'd be all set.
Exactly. And so apparently that nightcap ends up like drugging Barbara, and Ian apparently comes out as the Doctor returns to his console. He thinks everybody's asleep. He's knocked them out, and so that he can try to figure out what's going on. And then all of a sudden, this is the first cliffhanger that we get: a pair of hands reach out to try to strangle him, and they turn out to be Ian's.
Yeah, so this is where the doctor's so-called brilliant plan to pacify the natives has
Right.
backfired.
Yeah, horribly. Yeah. Because, hey, we only have 2 episodes. We got to keep things moving. We can't have them knocked out for an episode. Um, so whatever strange force is going on, and we don't really get an explanation for the force that affects them, do we? In this story, we know that it's the TARDIS, but how is the TARDIS really affecting them?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like that's the big hand wave of this story, I think. But apparently, this force, whatever it is, overrides the effect of the drug that the doctor slipped the Mickey that the doctor slipped Ian, and he apparently it compels him to stop the doctor from operating the TARDIS controls.
The power of the TARDIS compels you.
Yeah, exactly. It's like all glory to the Hypnotoad. And to use a Futurama reference, all of a sudden Ian kind of snaps out of it, and then he collapses.
Yeah, you bring up a good point too. That I think this is the first time, and we see this revisited periodically throughout the show.
Right.
Most prominently, when we get to the episode which I have referenced.
Yeah.
The Doctor's Wife, Matt Smith episode, right? Right? This is where this literally the TARDIS personified. But here is an early example of the TARDIS.
Did you wish really hard? I just love that line from Amy Pond.
This is the TARDIS having a personality of its own.
Yes.
And when one of them asks how this is possible, the Doctor literally hand waves at the bank of computers.
Well, again,
it doesn't think like us; it thinks like a machine.
Right. And Ian eventually tries to convince the Doctor that the TARDIS is alive, and they're like, the Doctor's like, nah, it's not alive. No. But he should know better later on. But that mythos had not been formed yet. So we're still trying to piece things together here in the early years. Barbara tries to reason with the Doctor, but the Doctor's he's and I think a little understandably upset because Ian just tried to strangle him. But
calm down, man.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, look, I brought you people into my TARDIS, and here you are trying to kill me here. But obviously, this is where the argument happens, where like, hey, I'm going to throw you off the ship, and Susan's pleading for them to stay. Then at first Susan kind of sides with her grandfather, but then like believes Ian and Barbara. And just when things get really heated, an alarm goes off. And it's not like the traditional cloister bell that we know today.
Yeah, they hadn't really come up with that yet. Because
that didn't really happen until, again, Logopolis. So see, that episode's important. You need to watch Logopolis. So this was just this really annoying alarm. And
it was called the fault alarm.
Yeah, the fault alarm. Yeah, the fault
the TARDIS
alarm.
has a dummy light.
Right. And it's here that Barbara kind of figures out that, hey, maybe it's the TARDIS. And the Doctor's like, that's not, no, that's impossible. And but hey, that's what it turns out to be. And that kind of, as things unfold, that kind of gets the Doctor kind of to respect Barbara a little more than probably he did up until this point. That, hey, you figured it out. I didn't figure it out, and I'll give you credit for that. So, thought that was interesting. So, Fred, anything else about Ian and Barbara before we move on?
Well, this is, like you said, they're the first two because, Susan being technically a Time Lord or a resident of Gallifrey. I don't know if she was technically was being groomed to be a Time Lord.
Yeah.
But these are our first two humans in this series, and also there was some shipping going on back then. It was a little unclear what their relationship was, but being the dashing male lead, and Barbara being, of similar
Right.
age, they kind of flirted with that, literally and figuratively.
Right. I mean, obviously it was the 60s. They didn't do anything improper,
Right.
but there was kind of a little bit of an underlying, um, I want to say it's not an overt flirtation. It's just more kind of a subtle, like fondness or what have you, that this attraction, I think.
Yes.
And even though nothing really happened from it, at least not until they left the TARDIS in the chase. But all right, let's move on to our third and final topic, and I want to talk about the TARDIS itself here.
Okay.
Specifically the malfunctioning TARDIS, as it turns out. This is kind of a real quick topic, but so we find out after all these events, and again, Barbara's intuition here, that the TARDIS is faulty, and then apparently, the fault locator lights up and shows faults in every system. So
Right. So I said it was a dummy light, but really
yeah,
what you had was like this panel, and it was supposed to show you at what point in the TARDIS there was a fault, and they were all lit up like a Christmas tree, like general alert.
exactly. And the doctor tries to explain, like, he goes, okay, well, okay, you see this one light would have been bad. All of them are lighting up, so it's really bad. And we're heading for the edge of destruction, the brink of disaster. Take your pick.
Ludicrous speed.
Yeah, like dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. And so this is where obviously the ticking clock happens. We get things moving. The story builds to its climax that, hey, we've only got 5 minutes to figure that. Actually, that's in a really interesting moment. The doctor tells Susan and Barbara that, oh, yeah, we've got 10 minutes to figure this out. And then he kind of pulls Ian aside and goes, we only really have 5 minutes to figure this out. I just lied to, so they won't know when it happens that, that it's, it'll wipe them out and they won't realize it because it's too soon. So
won't they be surprised when they try to count past 5?
Exactly. So I thought that was interesting. But the doctor ends up tracing the problem back to a broken spring on the fast return switch.
Did you look at the snapshot of the fast return switch?
Yes, I did. Well, actually, like I have, when I watched this on DVD, I was able to pause it. So yeah, I kind of wonder, and there's 2 reasons for this. Like, all right, so presumably they wrote fast return switch on the console in Sharpie or what have you, so that William Hartnell would know what lever to push. Presumably, like, hey, tap that button because that's the broken button.
That is the prevailing theory, that they did this for rehearsal purposes.
Right. But part of me kind of wonders, well, hey, the doctor stole the TARDIS, so maybe he kind of like wrote himself a note and said, okay, this is the fast return switch.
Oh, in case everything goes wrong.
That's my way of kind of explaining it continuity-wise. That he wrote that on there to kind of remind himself that that's the fast return switch.
This from the show that literally used styrofoam and bubble wrap. Yes.
Exactly. So
all explanations are possible.
As a longtime Classic Who fan, I've found many creative ways over the years to explain rather silly things happening on Doctor Who. And I take good pride in that.
That's it. And the Universal TARDIS translator also works for printed material.
Exactly. It impacts your perception of that printed material. How's that?
That's true. Okay.
It affects your visual perception in that way. That's the way I'm gonna explain that one. So see how creative you can be with the show.
What I liked was that he spent so long, and again, whether this was pacing or if they really had this much time to spare.
Right.
But he spent probably a full 2 minutes trying to explain how a little toggle switch could become stuck.
Right.
See here, there's a spring, and the spring has become loose, and that's why it got stuck.
Yeah. I think that was more to explain it for the kids. But,
Yes.
But yeah, it does kind of like, well, okay. And Susan, being as intelligent as she is, she should go like right up to him and go, "Grandfather, I know how a toggle switch works. I get it. I got the concept."
And you know, it's funny. I just realized right here on my desk, I have a lamp.
You don't have to like, pander to me here.
I have a desk lamp here, and I just realized it has a toggle switch that's malfunctioning.
Ooh, watch out. You're on the edge of destruction.
There's some symmetry here, yeah. So
Yes.
what happens with mine is if I push it to just the right position, the light will come on, and then if I mess with it at all, it'll flick off. So
Watch out, Fred.
I don't think I'm in danger of going to the beginning of time.
Yeah, we only have 5 minutes. All right. So the malfunction in this switch apparently forced it to become stuck. So essentially, the fast return switch kept returning, kind of like in, was it Rise of the Cybermen, where the Doctor had Mickey hold down this lever, and as they traveled forward in time, and apparently they traveled way forward in time, or and it's like, oh, you didn't let go of that, and what have you.
Yeah, I took a quick glance at Wikipedia or the fan wiki for this fast return switch, and it doesn't appear to have reoccurred in the TV series, but they've mentioned it several times in other media like books and maybe audio stories. Yeah, apparently it's a trope in those things.
I think it appeared, it's appeared in the modern era. I don't think it was really referenced in the classic era.
Okay.
If it was, I can't remember. So it may have been, but I can't remember offhand. So apparently they've headed all the way back to the beginning of this solar system. So they're kind of like, with the hydrogen inrush, and which kind of echoes the Peter Davison's first story, Castrovalva, if you remember that, where the Master set a trap for the Doctor and sent him going back to the Big Bang, essentially. So the Doctor fixes the switch, and just in the nick of time, of course, and everything returns to normal, and everybody can just finally breathe a sigh of relief. But it's interesting. Now, I want to get your thoughts on this. What did you think of the TARDIS, essentially as this force, or what have you, trying to warn the Doctor and everyone else, really, that, hey, there's a faulty switch, you need to fix it? That's what it boils down to.
This is not something that you've seen, in terms of a mental connection,
right?
Ever since. Like I said, at various times, at
least in the classic era.
Right. At various times, like you said, they came up with the cloister bell at a certain point where the TARDIS is kind of like warning you of mortal danger.
Right.
But yeah, this mental connection, it was kind of an interesting twist, and lends itself to a sort of a low-budget approach. But other than that, they don't use it very much.
Well, and it does affect it, continuity-wise, canon-wise. It does explain. It fits in with the the modern belief that the Doctor is telepathically linked to the TARDIS.
Yes. Okay.
And that there is, whatever reason, Time Lords and their TARDISes, they have this connection. Maybe it's almost like a symbiotic relationship.
Right. It's like the horse and rider or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so they have this bond, and because of this, maybe because it was so early in their relationship, the TARDIS essentially had to kind of scream at the Doctor and go, "Hey, fix this."
Right.
Whereas maybe later on, the Doctor would get this more intuitive vibe from the TARDIS, because he's more experienced with it and kind of can pick up on the little subtle nuances more, I guess.
Yep.
That's my take on it anyway. But anything else about the TARDIS in this one?
Um,
Or anything else about the episode?
let's see. Um, no, I think that's about all I had.
Okay.
Um, like I said, it's kind of interesting the transition that they make here to the next episode, which is something that they kind of lost at a certain point in the classic era. But this first couple seasons anyway, you had this sort of ongoing story where it wasn't just like a coming up next time. It was actually leading into the following story.
Right. To show you that it's all like everything's connected, that one story flows right into the next.
Which kind of eliminates those time gaps that Big Finish later on, took advantage of.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Although, there was a couple gaps here and there, but by and large, yeah, you're right. It did that end of story cliffhanger to keep you watching. It obviously was probably great for the show as it was trying to take off, but yeah, it doesn't leave a lot of gaps for things like novels or Big Finish audios or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So with that in mind, do you have any favorite lines of this episode that you liked?
No, I didn't really put down any favorite
Any
lines.
memorable quotes? That's okay, because I got some, but I just thought I'd give you the opportunity to share. So
I guess if I had to just generalize,
yes.
my favorite lines were any time that William Hartnell was flubbing.
Well,
Flubbing
yes.
and crosstalk always fascinates me in this classic era because you see how real live television works,
Right, and if you watched the Adventures in Space and Time TV movie docudrama,
Yeah, I saw that.
about Hartnell's life as becoming the Doctor, which is a must watch with David Bradley.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously there's a reason for that, as his health continued to fail.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. One exchange I really liked between Barbara and the Doctor, obviously, is that we talked about, where she lays right into him. So where Barbara says, "How dare you? Do you realize, you stupid old man, that you'd have died in the Cave of Skulls if Ian hadn't made fire for you?" The Doctor's like, "Oh, And Barbara continues, "And what about what we went through with the Daleks? Not just for us, but for you and Susan too. On and all because you tricked us into going down to the city." The Doctor's like, Barbara continues, "Accuse us? You ought to go down on your hands and knees and thank us. But gratitude's the last thing you'll ever have, or any other sort of common sense either." So great exchange. I love that exchange.
And a nice recap of the season, or the season to that point.
Exactly. And just like, we've had 3 really big adventures now, or at least we had 2, and then up till this point. And hey, how about a little something for the effort here? We helped you out. We saved your life. You want to throw us off the ship? Come on. And then Ian, another exchange between Ian and the Doctor, where Ian says, "Have you any idea where we are, Doctor?" And the Doctor replies, "Where is not as important as why, young man." I thought that was a good quote.
Yeah.
And let's see. Another one was William Hartnell's big speech, where he's kind of geeking out over the idea of going back to the beginning of the solar system a little bit. He goes, I know. I said it would take the force of a total solar system to attract the power away from my ship. We're at the very beginning, this new start of a solar system. Outside, the atoms are rushing toward one another, fusing, coagulating, until minute little collections of matter are created. And so the process goes on and on until dust is formed. Dust then becomes a solid entity, a new birth of a sun and its planets. It's a very doctorish quote, I think.
Yeah.
And a lot of stuff that especially like we got out of the recent Jodie Whittaker era, moments like that. I thought was rather good, where she's kind of geeking out over stuff a little bit. It's like even though they're in this great peril, the doctor is just like, "Oh, this is cool. I'm digging this."
Yeah, well,
And
I guess that's the perspective you get from hundreds of years of surviving perilous situations. You kind of learn to enjoy the moment.
exactly, and obviously the doctor. One of the reasons he wanted to go out to explore, and now he gets to do that. So he's gets to indulge himself here. One last quote from the doctor, where he says, and this is rather a rather poignant quote: "As we learn about each other, so we learn about ourselves." And that was a little words of wisdom from the doctor to Barbara when he's trying to kind of smooth things over after really upsetting her.
Perhaps this inspirational quote will help.
Exactly. Let me pull up my pocketbook of quotes to reassure you. All right. So with that, do you have a rating for this episode? Now we do things here on a 10 scale. We talked about. So do you have a rating?
I'm going to give this, we'll knock off a couple points maybe for going over the top dramatically.
Right.
But again, that was sort of because of the era. So we'll give it an 8 out of 10 faulty toggle switches.
Very nice. I was going to go with that one. And actually, we're in sync on that one. I totally agree. I give it 8 as well. 8 healing bandages.
Hey, all right.
So
take that, Band-Aid.
Exactly. So where are those healing bandages? Like for the rest of the series, who knows? They probably could have come in handy a few times. Maybe somebody.
They did establish that the TARDIS has an extensive wardrobe pretty early on.
That's true.
So.
That is true. They did. Like this is kind of like the first reference to a wardrobe room.
Right. Oh, and another little reference to classic Who.
Yeah.
You can count the number of times that they visit time periods in which the BBC wardrobe department has an extensive wardrobe available.
Right. Exactly. It's like, well, if there's been a production done about it, chances are it's in the Doctor's wardrobe.
Right. Alien planets that look kind of Elizabethan or medieval
or any kind of Sherlock Holmes-ish type Victorian era.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, stuff like that. Go figure. It's funny how that works. All right. Now, really quickly, I have a reverse the polarity segment.
Okay.
Because we're going forward in time instead of backwards. So we're not reversing the polarity. We're reversing the polarity. And so I want to reverse the polarity to 2008 this time with Midnight, the 10th episode from Series 4 in 2008, written by Russell T. Davies.
RTD.
Exactly. And this is obviously a big 10th Doctor and Donna episode, although Donna doesn't really factor in this much. She's more of a cameo. This is primarily a 10th Doctor episode, and kind of also a bottle episode, because the 10th Doctor in the story, they visit this resort planet of Midnight, where the surface is bathed in this like lethal radiation from what is called an extonic star. And the Doctor plans to take this shuttle tour to check out this waterfall made of sapphires, while Donna goes off and does the spa thing. And so he goes on the shuttle, and halfway through this tour, the shuttle unexpectedly stops. And they kind of they're worried about maybe the radiation shielding is the problem. And one of the passengers claims to have seen something moving outside. And so as they call for a rescue shuttle, it's going to take a while for them to arrive. And the Doctor and the other passengers end up kind of talking with one another. But then all of a sudden, this one passenger named Sky starts repeating what everybody else is saying. And this is where it gets a little creepy. At some point, eventually, throughout as the episode progresses, she only starts to repeat what the Doctor's saying. And the doctor kind of like comes to the conclusion that, well, this must be some alien force or entity from outside the ship. Well, hey, doesn't that sound a lot like what they were worried about in The Edge of Destruction, which
Yeah.
is my connection here, and that some alien force is trying to affect them. And the doctor tries to communicate with Sky, tries to reason with it, but as the doctor converses, Sky starts saying things before the doctor says them, making them think that the entity has moved on to possess the doctor. And so then things take off in another really paranoid bit where they think the doctor is now possessed by the alien, and they're talking about throwing him off the ship. So again, this is a lot like The Edge of Destruction in a lot of ways. And then so the other passengers are ready to chuck him off the ship. But then one of the passengers kind of picks up on the fact that the Sky uses the doctor's unusual phrase like allons-y, and that he first used when he introduced himself. And apparently that kind of tips her off that, hey, Sky is the real threat. And so she grabs Sky and heads out the hatch, taking them both out. And the threat is over. The passengers get rescued. They return to the resort. The doctor tells Donna what happened. Donna's trying to figure out, what happened, and the doctor kind of she starts to copy him when he says molto bene, and doctor's like, don't do that. and then he kind of looks away wistfully, as only David Tennant can do. So that's the episode. But just like The Edge of Destruction, it's a very psychological episode, and a lot of paranoia going on, a lot of you're not quite sure what's going on, and so if you like The Edge of Destruction, I definitely recommend checking out Midnight, or vice versa. But
Yeah,
so,
it sounds like it'd definitely be a good follow-up.
Yep. I don't know if you've seen that episode, Fred, but
Not recently, so I'm gonna have to go back and check it out.
Yeah, I definitely recommend it.
And that was during that period of time when the episodes were kind of broken up.
Yeah.
So there was big gaps as we're used to having. So it's worth rewatching.
Exactly. We do have some time now because, hey, we're still waiting for Series 12. That won't be here till 2020, so you got some time to check out that. All right. And of course, obviously listening to some Next Stop Everywhere, right? Right? Okay.
That's right.
All right. So we have some listener feedback this time. That's actually regarding The Edge of Destruction, because thankfully a couple of our regular listeners wrote in
cool.
Their thoughts on that. So I thought I'd read that really quickly. Holly from Wisconsin writes in about The Edge of Destruction. Hey all. For this being only a 2-episode story, it sure had a lot of mystery and suspense as to why everyone was acting the way they were. The TARDIS sure has an interesting way of letting them know. Must have been before the cloister bell. Yep, yes it was. That didn't show up until the Tom Baker era. Once they figured out what was going on, things were on the way back to normal, and not much else to say, but it sounds like, Holly, hopefully you enjoyed it, and yeah, it was only 2 episodes, but essentially the length of a modern episode, and I think I'm glad you enjoyed it. So, and thanks for writing in. We really appreciate that. Paul Beck Paul from Australia writes in. He writes in, "Hi Charles and Fred." So Fred already getting
Hello.
Fred getting an advanced shout out from Paul. Who would have thought that one tiny switch spring could have caused so much trouble in the TARDIS? Some of these early shows seem a bit dated, especially when compared to the fast pacing of today's episodes. Having said that, for an episode that is filming using basically one studio set, it holds your attention. It feels very reminiscent of an episode of The Outer Limits. I thought it was more like The Twilight Zone, but I'll go with The Outer Limits.
That was another sci-fi series of the time period, sure.
Yeah, and obviously in the same ballpark, yeah. So I'll go with that. Paul adds, "Did you notice that the Doctor's reaction to the suggestion that the TARDIS is alive?" Yeah, he was a little surprised by that. Maybe he wasn't, maybe he hadn't quite figured that out, or maybe just because the mythos hadn't quite figured that out yet. Also, I like how the fast return switch is written in felt pen on the console. That was obviously something that Fred pointed out, and yeah, I thought that was good. So, and you obviously heard my explanation for that. Anyway, it was good to see the original crew of the Doctor, Susan, Ian, and Barbara again, and remember how it all started. Great fun. Sending you both my kindest regards as always, Paul. P.S. Am looking forward to Genesis of the Daleks review as it is one of my favorite stories ever. So yeah, Genesis of the Daleks. I know we kind of on the show we talked about that about doing that next, but thankfully Fred was kind enough to join us here so that we could help fill in the gap a little bit before we talk about that with Jesse. So next time on Next Up Everywhere, Genesis of the Daleks. Now this is a big Tom Baker story, so hopefully Fred, you'll be listening.
I sure will.
As
yes.
we talk about that. This is a big one. Obviously, it's the origin of the Daleks. You don't get any bigger than that. Plus, we get the debut of Davros. And obviously becomes a very important character in Doctor Who mythos. The creator of the Daleks. And has one of the most iconic moments probably in the entire series, from the modern day to the present day, where the fourth Doctor, Tom Baker, holds two strands of wires up to each other and asks himself, do I have that right to put these two wires together and end the threat of the Daleks once and for all?
Yep, so here it is. It's 12 years after the initial Dalek story.
Yep.
And we're trying to decide if they're going to end it all.
Well, had to do it sooner or later. Essentially, it's the kind of argument like, well, if I could go back in time and kill Hitler, should I do that?
Right.
Well, only this time with the Daleks, because hey, the Doctor, and this is kind of like we find out that he's kind of Time Lord sanctioned here in this one, and we'll talk about that. But
right.
A big Tom Baker episode, a story. And it's a 6-parter, so it's going to run roughly about 2 hours, 15 minutes, all in all. But it's worth it because it's a good one. So, and probably one of the most loved stories from the classic era, if not today, too. So check it out. Genesis of the Daleks.
Yes, and Sarah, Jane, and Harry are the companions for this one.
Exactly. Yep. And this is Harry's first encounter with the Daleks, and this Sarah Jane. This is kind of like her. Really, this is kind of what tipped her off in the 10th Doctor era when she first heard Davros's voice, and she thought he was dead. But guess what? He wasn't when he showed up in The Stolen Earth and Journey's End. So a little bit of a nod to Genesis of the Daleks in that story. So definitely one you want to watch. And thankfully now I have it on Spiffy Blu-ray because I got the first Tom Baker season, which really is season 7? Set.
Season 12.
So I'm sorry, season 12. I'm thinking John Pertwee.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. John Pertwee's first season was season 7.
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, because I got to see a panel with the producer of the current BBC Blu-ray editions.
Right.
And there have been various questions about them, such as, if I invested over the years in VHS and DVD, then what's the point of the Blu-ray? Or conversely, if I never have, am I going to miss something by just buying the Blu-ray?
Right.
And the answer is that you're gaining in terms of production value because where possible they're doing upgrades and restorations.
Right.
And also they're going to include any of the previous materials.
Right. Yeah. I've been buying them. I got the first Peter Davison season 19.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to be getting season 18, the last Tom Baker season when that's out. I'm getting them even though I already have all the DVDs. I have all the DVDs, people. But I'm upgrading because for one thing, you get nicer picture in a high def, and they're redoing a lot of the audio. Like there's some new audio mixes. Definitely recommend it. And they're updating some of the special effects, which
Right.
and some of these stories really need updating.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, it
So
was cool,
plus you get all the documentary stuff that you
on a
had
whole
before.
different topic. I'm a fan of the original Star Trek series, and
Right.
those remastered special effects, I think, really kind of help you to enjoy the series, where you're not seeing the gray blocks and wires and things like that.
Right. Now
So,
they don't go to the extent I don't think that the Star Trek um, Blu-rays and whatnot did with their updated editions, where you have like complete like planets and and the TARDIS or whatever in this case, but there are like a lot of anything energy related or anything that I know that for the Revenge of the Cybermen, when I watched that, it definitely improved the effects of the crash landing in that story. So highly recommended. I definitely recommend getting those on Blu-ray.
okay, yeah, I've been adding them to my Amazon wish
Definitely,
list. So,
definitely, definitely worth it. And
as
if
my
nothing
birthday
else,
approaches,
yeah. And if nothing else, it gives me the chance to archive some of the DVDs so I can make some space on my shelf for these much slimmer season sets.
yeah, cool.
So
Yeah, no, I think it's a good jumping in point for me.
exactly. And if you don't already own the episodes, I definitely recommend it because it's classic Who, and they put a lot into these, and I definitely recommend it. All right.
Yeah, the other thing that he was saying was don't be concerned if the seasons are done out of order because it's a negotiating process as far as what they get clearance for and what are the most popular.
Right.
They might alternate like a really popular series with a less popular.
Right. Yeah, we haven't. So far, we've already had like there's two Tom Bakers, the first and the last season, and then the Peter Davison's first season, but nothing yet from the Colin Baker, Sylvester McCoy, or the first three Doctors
Mm,
yet.
right.
So keep your fingers crossed. We'll get more,
And they're
hopefully.
going to the end, people. They've committed to that, so don't worry that they're going to lose interest at some point.
Exactly. All right, Fred. Since you were kind enough, well, first I should say, let me do this first. If you want to be like Fred, who's kind enough to post on our Facebook page, on our Twitter, responding to things and providing his insights, his wonderful insights.
Well, I'm no Paul and Holly.
No, you do just fine. Don't worry about that. But the if you want to be like him, if you want to reach us here at Next Stop Everywhere, and you can reach us at nextstopeverywheresmg@gmail.com. Don't forget the SMG. Next Stop Everywhere SMG@gmail.com. The Gmail. Or you can reach us on Twitter at nextstopsmg. Don't forget the SMG there as well, at nextstopsmg on Twitter. Or on Facebook at Next Stop Everywhere, the Doctor Who podcast. We'd love to have you like us there or follow us on Twitter. That'd be great. Or you can also follow us on our spiffy new Instagrams at Next Stop Everywhere podcast. There on Instagram. If you're so
Yeah, I did
inclined.
that.
Yeah,
Sure.
drop us a line. We'd love to
Um,
have you do that.
I think I
Uh,
happened to join Instagram. I think you were one of the sort of motivating factors. You, my daughter. I will not put those on the same level, but
right.
it was concurrent.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't claim to be a big Instagram guy, but I post things occasionally, stuff that captures my interest or some cool thing that I happen to come across. So I'm in there as well, but I'll give my contact information later because Fred, now's your time to do a shameless plug or give us your contact info so that people can find you on the interwebs. So
Okay.
how might they do that?
Well, on a whole different topic, if you like the TV show Psych, USA Network show,
Right?
ran a few years back, recently had a movie. I do a podcast for the TV Rewind Network, along with Stephanie Zimmer and Company.
Right?
Um, it's called Psych Rewind. So you can check that out. We have a good time with it. We're currently in season 6 out of 8.
Right.
We actually covered the Psych movie out of order because it was sort of a current event that we were not expecting. Very exciting. And so if you like Sean, Gus, and the gang, come and join us over there. We're happy to have Karen help us out with the Twin Peaks themed episode.
Yep. That yours truly was on. I was on that episode as well.
Yeah, see?
Where we talk dual spires.
This is why I was confused before when I was asking you about crossover. I knew we had spoken once before. Yeah, we had a good time with that, and but that was again sort of an isolated topic. Generally speaking, Psych is funny for people who enjoy crime procedurals. So if you like a little humor in your crime procedural, come join us there. I am on Twitter, FFIRESTINE, and I have a home fitness sort of interest. Not as actively anymore, but I'm at homefitnessgeek.com and in the Facebook group Home Fitness Geek if you want to check those kind of things out. It's still the beginning of the year, so everybody's interested in a little self-improvement at the beginning of the year. So you can check that out. And I'm on Instagram, Fred Firestine, where you can see pretty much pictures of dogs and cats.
Excellent. So everybody follow Fred. Everybody give him some love because obviously he did a great job here at Next Stop Everywhere. And I think it's only kind that we show him how much we appreciated him for this episode and for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you and Karen and Charles. I'm sorry, and Jesse,
yeah.
And
I'm
all
Charles,
the
he's Jesse.
I know, I get so confused. Just all the people I get to hear from week to week.
Well, Well, thank you. And so yeah, everybody follow Fred because he's awesome. All right. As for me, I'm at Charles Skaggs on the Twitter machine, at Charles Skaggs on the Instagram, Facebook at Charles Skaggs in Hilliard, Ohio, and my blog of geeky things, if I can get the button to work.
Damn good coffee. And hot.
Damn good coffee and hot, where I talk about all the shows that we talk about here on Next Stop Everywhere, or all kinds of comic book sci-fi news, or news of my other podcasts they do for Southgate Media, including Ghostwood, the Twin Peaks podcast, where I talk about all things Twin Peaks and David Lynch that I do with Zan Sprouse, or the Phantom Zone podcast that I do with Karen Lindsay. Hopefully, we're trying to get Karen back on track physically, health-wise.
Come on, Karen.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Everybody give your wishes, best wishes to Karen as she hopefully gets back on track. And also Titan Talk, the Titans podcast they do with Jesse Jackson. And I know Jesse kind of has been dialing things back a little bit, but we're going to be talking, hopefully soon, we're going to be talking about the first 13 episodes of Young Justice. We're going to be doing like a half-season recap and or in review, what have you. We'll be talking about that soon, and then that will kind of give us something to talk about until Doom Patrol when that starts, and we'll be talking about that, the DC Universe series, in February. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. And maybe, hopefully, Karen will be healthy enough to join us on that. That would be nice. So, yeah, for everybody wondering about Karen, I just got email from her over the weekend. Apparently, she tried to do her Gotham Undercover podcast, and her voice is completely shredded.
Wow.
And she's not sure. She's trying to get back on track, but it sounds like at least otherwise she seems to be okay. So maybe once she gets her voice back, maybe hopefully we'll get her back here. But in the meantime, it's great to have people like Fred join us, filling in. Thank you so much, Fred, for filling in. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity. Like I said, I've been listening to Doctor Who podcasts for quite a while, and it's very exciting to be able to participate.
Yeah, and obviously it's a shame that Jesse and Karen aren't here, but maybe we'll have you back on once hopefully Karen's on the rebound and Jesse's back from his siesta in time and space.
Sounds great. Yeah, I'd love to.
All right. Everybody, so come on back for episode 131 of Next Stop Everywhere. We're talking Genesis of the Daleks with Jesse Jackson, So heads up, Jesse. It's your turn next. You promised. And we're going to talk some classic Tom Baker. And other than that, everybody, thanks again for listening. We really appreciate you. And thank you, Fred. And we'll see you next time right here, Next Stop Everywhere, the Doctor Who podcast. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.